we will get started. So thanks for being here. Really appreciate you sharing your knowledge. All right. Welcome, folks, to our second day of the Leafline Trails Summit. Yesterday, I saw many of you in a session oriented around the value of trails. And today we have an all-star cast of speakers lined up to help inform us about resourcing our network. We know that funding trails is a really critical step to moving them from idea to reality, and it's hard to get funding. So today we'll orient around federal, state, and local lines of funding with a handful of speakers. But as we get started, I just wanted to ground us in the coalition and our mission. So Gabriel Avila-Mooney with King County Parks is co-tech facilitator with me today. Really appreciate your help again, Gabriel. And I am Claire Martini. I use she, her pronouns, and am the project manager for Leafline Trails Coalition. And our session today is oriented around accessing federal, state, and local funding for trails. Wanted to just briefly share our mission as a coalition is to connect the trails network across the central Puget Sound region to improve health, community, quality of life, mobility, and access for all. And folks who were part of yesterday's session heard me say, we're going to be actively using the chat. You may have the opportunity to ask a few questions, and we would just ask that everyone live out our coalition values as part of today's session. We, in part of our chartering process between 2018 and 2019, we affirmed a values-based approach that has us being bold, collaborative, equitable, transparent, innovative, and results-oriented. So we'll do our best to make those values sort of the grounding for today's session here. I will now turn it over to Monica Lears with King County Parks, who has been absolutely fantastic at assembling an all-star cast today to walk us through more about how today will be structured.
Great. Thanks so much, Claire, and welcome everybody. It's great to have everyone here. I think if you ask anyone involved in trails to name their biggest challenge, funding is definitely likely to be at the top of that list. So this session will focus on the varied approaches to funding trails. We'll learn about specific grant programs, as well as leveraging partnerships and other strategies. You'll see here the agenda is going to highlight 3 sections or categories of funding: federal, state, and local levels. And as Claire mentioned, we've got an all-star cast of presenters, and we're just so thankful to them for joining us today to share their expertise. You'll note on the agenda that the section on federal funding is split up into 2 parts, and that was to accommodate our speaker schedules today. So after the speakers are done with their presentations, there'll be time for Q&A within each of the 3 sections. And we'll use the chat to capture your questions. And you can also use the raise hand icon when we open the Q&A. And at that time, you can unmute your microphone to ask your question. And at the very end of our session today, we'll have some time for you to share any closing thoughts, as well as ask any lingering questions. We have a lot to cover. So as facilitator, I will be watching the time and keeping us on track. Before we get started, the session is going to be recorded, so you're welcome to turn off your camera. And with the exception of the speakers, everyone will be muted during the session. So let's get started. Our first section is on federal funding, and our speaker today is Kevin Mills, who's the Vice President of Policy with the Rails to Trails Conservancy. The RTC is based in Washington, D.C. and works with communities to preserve and use rail corridors by transforming them into rail trails. Since 2006, Kevin has overseen RTC's policy agenda, keeping RTC in the forefront of efforts to increase investments in active transportation with the goal of creating a nationwide network of trails. Thanks for joining us today, Kevin.
Thanks so much, Monica. I want to talk today about federal funding to support trail systems, and excited to be with you because the work you're really doing in the central Puget Sound for a regional network is really on the cutting edge of what's going on in our movement today. And I want to start with surface transportation programs, as that's really the bread and butter of federal policy as it relates to trail funding. And I particularly want to start with dedicated active transportation funding. That's as opposed to just programs for which trails are eligible. And the importance of that is that those are dollars we know are going to be there. We can plan for them, and we get apples to apples competition for those dollars, and that's more inviting for folks to come forward with their proposals. So we think these dedicated programs are crucial. And so three I want to bring up: transportation alternatives, recreational trails, and those are two legacy programs that have been around for 30 years. And then active transportation connectivity grants, which is a new initiative. And we think these three together are the pillars of where dedicated transportation funding needs to go. Next slide, please. So start with transportation alternatives. This is the nation's top source of funding for trails. It's competitive grants that, even though these are federal dollars, they're awarded by states and urbanized regions. And over the last 7-8 years, more than 95% of this money has gone to walking, biking, and trails. There are other eligibilities like historic preservation, but they're a very minor part of how these resources are actually allocated. Washington's current apportionment is more than $11 million per year. And in the pending surface transportation reauthorization bill that I believe, in fact, will pass this fall, that will boost transportation alternatives funding by an average of 70% over the next 5 years. And one of the questions, strategy questions, when we get to pivoting to implementation is, how do we want to focus those dollars? Of course, you could just run them through the usual channels and say, well, we can do more projects than before. But it may be that folks with bigger aspirations like you have some great needs and could use maybe some larger grants to build multiple segments of your network. And so that's something we're thinking about as we pivot. The Recreational Trails Program is the only federal transportation source that can go for trail maintenance. And so it's important to an overall strategy for building and maintaining our trail system. This program uses recreational fuel taxes and dedicates them to trails, both non-motorized and motorized trails. And but this money goes through, is from the Highway Trust Fund, and that's why it's part of transportation policy. It's implemented in your state by the Washington Recreation and Conservation Office, and they, as my understanding is, issue competitive grants on the order of $3.6 million a year and have a deadline this year of November 1st for awards that'll be made in June. Another thing nationally it's important about this program is that it requires state trail advisory bodies, and that's part of how we kind of keep the trails community united over time is through those bodies. Next. So now on the cutting edge, you're on the cutting edge with your trail network here. I've got a little image of, and basically we have been advocating as our top legislative priority in this reauthorization that we need to add to those legacy programs of transportation alternatives and recreational trails a pot of money that would be directly allocated out by the federal government directly to grant applicants, and that it be much larger grants than what you see out of those traditional programs. So we call it the Connecting America's Active Transportation System Act. We have a bill in both the Senate and the House. It's bipartisan in the Senate. And we have $500 million per year in there for regional networks like your building, as well as longer spine trails that connect between communities. And the pending infrastructure bill would authorize these grants, so essentially create this new pot of money, this new program. And they say that it's authorized for $200 million a year. That is subject to appropriations. So we don't, with passage of the infrastructure bill, this will not be a done deal. It will be a milestone that sets us up to advocate next year in the appropriations battle for an allocation of money to fill that pot. So that's where we are with that. And of course, the authorization amount is not necessarily a limit of what could be appropriated. So we could go back to that original figure of 500 million and advocate for that in the appropriations bill. There's a pending Build Back Better Act. You may have heard of this as the Democrat-led Budget Reconciliation Bill. And that includes eligibility for a number of pots for which trails could benefit. The one I particularly draw attention to is the equity pot, because these connectivity grants are one of the explicit eligibilities alongside tearing down of freeways that have divided communities. And another program that we have championed, which is about more equitable transportation planning and making sure that there's money for very genuine community engagement. Next slide, please. So now let's talk about eligible programs. So those were the three big dedicated programs in transportation policy, but there are a number of other programs for which trails can compete. These are the four that I think are most notable. One is RAISE. It was originally started as TIGER in the Obama administration in 2009. And this is a federal multimodal competition. So, large amount of money. It's ranged from 500 million to $1 billion a year. But the applications far outstrip the supply. It's very competitive, but sometimes regional trail networks have succeeded in getting grants on the order of $20 million from this pot. There's the Surface Transportation Block Grant Program. These are funds that cascade down to states and regions. These are the most flexible federal dollars available to states and regions. And so they're coveted by state DOTs. And again, competition is multimodal against anything that is eligible for transportation funding, essentially. Then there's Congestion Mitigation and Air Quality Improvement Program. This is through the Clean Air Act. These are regional dollars, and they're not upfront grants. They're on a reimbursement basis after you've spent the money. And then there's the Highway Safety Improvement Program, where states have strategic highway safety plans to reduce fatalities and serious injuries. And bicycle and pedestrian trails, if they're public, are eligible for those dollars. Next. And I want to mention a few things beyond transportation policy that if you're going to be creative about how to access dollars, you might want to think about. One is economic development. One example of that is the American Rescue Plan passed at the beginning of this year for COVID relief. And more recently, states and communities have been thinking about ways of accessing those dollars that support trails. So one example would be the state of Indiana has the Next Level Trails Initiative, and they put $60 million of their American Rescue Plan dollars into that. Then on the recreation front, I would say that as part of the outdoor recreation community, this is a sector that's been on a roll of late legislatively. And last year, the Great American Outdoors Act passed. It had $900 million a year for the Land and Water Conservation Fund for parks and open space. And it had, it was a pre-existing program, but one that didn't have a permanent source of funding. And then there is the federal public lands maintenance backlog that is supporting. Another category, which I think is, we'll call it an formative stage of accessing this for trails, which is disaster relief. Tremendous amount of federal dollars go into disaster relief. It's a growing category because of increased climate related incidents around the country, and so there's an increasing focus on climate resiliency, and the more that we can think about creative ways to get trails into the conversation of how we do smart floodwater mitigation and what have you, I think the further we'll get going forward. So finally, I just want to say we're in our movement, we're at an inflection point. The regional networks, like what you've been, what you're working on, and this particular picture is the San Francisco Bay Area, where we've got a 2,500 mile trail network we're working on. The Great American Rail Trail, of course, the most grandiose version of a spine trail going all the way across the country, and the western terminus being in your part of the world. And those are all part of connected trail systems. And we think, working together, we can increasingly get trail systems to be seen as essential community assets, not just nice to have amenities, and that the ambition and the greater benefits that come from providing this kind of connectivity is going to just accelerate that process. I can take some questions if you'd like.
Thank you, Kevin. Now we'll go ahead and open the Q&A. We have about 3 minutes. So if people would like to put their questions in the chat. I see one from Diane Iverson. How about emergency management funds due to climate change issues such as tsunamis, earthquakes, etc.?
Yeah, that's what I was referring to on the second to last slide in terms of disaster relief. And this is something we're increasingly looking closely at Rails Trails Conservancy, recognizing that the amount of money that goes into this is truly huge. It dwarfs some of the routine programs we all look to, and so we really think it can be done in a smarter way if we're thinking ahead of time as trails, not just designed right for the trail's sake, but being part of the community-wide strategy for managing some of these natural disasters. I think the more we can do that, just the more we elevate the importance of trails to communities and the political will to invest in them.
Okay, thank you, Kevin. Any federal health equity funding possibilities?
That's a fantastic question. We work a lot with the health sector, and they certainly have been supportive of the transportation funding to support trails. There are not a lot of things in federal health legislation, much because that tends to focus on healthcare and insurance and questions like that, much more so than prevention. But there is the section of the Center for Disease Control that it works on physical activity levels, is our closest partner in the health sector of the government, and so we're very much in sync and collaborate closely on work. But it's not so much federal legislation saying here's a pot of money for health equity, so much as strategically using what resources there are to get people more physically active. And of course we do advocate for that physical activity work to be and chronic disease section of CDC to be well funded, because that's, we know, is where the activity comes out of in the federal government. So it makes them a good partner, and there's some outreach that can be done through county health departments around the country who are taking their cues from the CDC and what have you. Those are the ways we tend to partner, more so than a big pot of money to get your trail built.
Great, thanks. Also, I just thank you, Kevin, for answering the questions. We'll have one more question, but first I'd like to just note that anyone who's listening or participating via phone, you can email your questions to Claire Martini at claire@leaflinetrails.org. We want to make sure that you all also have a way to participate today. Okay, we'll have time for one more question from Larry. Federalized dollars bring very significant hoops for local agencies to jump through. This is particularly onerous for parks departments and also smaller jurisdictions in rural areas. What strategies can you suggest? Is there any movement to make federal dollars more accessible to get trails?
Yeah, really great question. One thing in terms of the new programs that may be passed in the coming months is that the federal government itself, USDOT, will be allocating more discretionary grants directly to applicants than in the past. I had mentioned some ways that already happens, like the RAISE program, but there'll be some new programs like that, including, we hope, these active transportation connectivity grants. One thing we're exploring is whether USDOT could play a role in making one large call for proposals and make it their problem to figure out which of these pots of money it should come from, right? So that you have essentially a universal application that makes it so you don't have to think about, well, maybe I'll apply to those 3 programs, put in separate applications with separate requirements, and that you'd have one place to go to where you could. It's still indeterminate whether we get DOT to do things this way, but that's one of the things we're exploring, is suggesting a consolidation of the application process. Another thing is, insofar as these some of these grants cascade down through the states and through the regions, is there's something called categorical exclusions, and as to environmental review requirements, we think that it's an underutilized tactic by those agencies giving out the dollars to say, well, basically these are the kinds of projects that help the environment and that are on a small scale and that really shouldn't have to go through, full-blown environmental review. And so you can, basically apply this idea of categorical exclusion to make sure that they don't, that those requirements are not as challenging in that regard.
Thank you so much, Kevin. If again, anyone has any other questions that didn't get answered today, please email them to claire@leaflinetrails.org, and we'll try to get you all the information and answers to your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks again, Kevin. Okay, we are going to move on to our next section on state funding. And our presenters today are Barb Chamberlain, Marguerite Austin, and Christine Mahler. Barb is the director of the Active Transportation Division with the Washington State Department of Transportation. Prior to that, she served as the executive director of Washington Bikes and as an elected representative in the state of Idaho. Marguerite is the manager of the Recreation and Conservation Grant Section of the Washington State Recreation and Conservation Office, also known as RCO. She has extensive experience working with organizations seeking funding for outdoor recreation and conservation purposes. And Christine is the executive director of the Washington Wildlife and Recreation Coalition and has served in that role since 2018. Previously, she worked extensively in fundraising and nonprofit leadership in Washington, D.C. Welcome to Barb, Marguerite, and Christine. Barb, we'll turn it over to you to get us started.
All right. Let me do a little fiddling with my screen here. And I know Gabe is running the slides, but just to make sure I've got the notes all queued up, and you can roll straight through the slide with the bio and go to my Mythbusters slide, which I like to include just because folks often will hear, well, drivers pay for everything. And you can just say, no, they don't. I pay sales tax, I pay federal income tax. There are many ways that all of us pay for transportation. So thank you for that. And if you go to the Active Transportation Plan, Part 1 that we published in May, we have an appendix that gives a bit more information on that. And that is a link I will drop into the chat. I also need to take this opportunity to ask you to review and comment on Part 2 of the Active Transportation Plan. It's open through the end of October. It speaks directly to both performance metrics and strategies around trail development and how WashDOT can partner with local agencies to do more of that. So please take a look at it. And Part 1 provides a lot of context, but you don't have to have read Part 1 to comment on Part 2. And now we'll get into funding, the thing we're here for, the names to know in terms of the funding awards that my division oversees. It's SRTS and PBP. That's Safe Routes to School and Pedestrian Bicyclist Program. They have some things in common. Some projects would be eligible in either bucket. Public agencies and tribes can apply. We go through a 2-year cycle. So we'll be doing a call for projects early next year, and we'll hold a webinar with detail on how to apply. A number of project types are eligible, including trails. So to Kevin's point, some things are dedicated, some things are eligible. These are eligibility categories you might think of. And in our evaluation criteria, safety is 40% of the total points. So in terms of your trail projects, thinking about how they contribute to safety through reducing crash exposure is a really important quality. We also evaluate equity, value, the project quality itself, and deliverability, meaning can that agency put that piece together? These are highly competitive programs. We are funded through a level that the legislature sets, and we're able to award about 20%, 1 in 5. And I'll have a couple of slides going forward that will give you more of a picture. In the next slide, we lay out the funding cycle. As a 2-year cycle, in the even numbered years, we do the call for projects. We go through a competitive review process and award points in those categories I mentioned. We submit a ranked list to the legislature, and the legislature tells us how far down will we fund. And we usually have a projected amount from them where we're matching, but they might go a little bit farther down. So this last session, they actually awarded another 10 million, so we could pick up a few more projects. We get that money out in a reimbursement setup. So the jurisdiction starts expending and then we reimburse that. And then we start the next cycle with collision and equity analysis and begin our outreach. Now I'll give you a little bit more on each specific program. Ped bike program, PBP, we're seeking to eliminate fatal and serious injury crashes, make better quality facilities available, and trails certainly get a gold star for that, and increase the number of people who are walking and biking. I mentioned how competitive they are, and this next slide gives you a picture of that. You see a high steep line going up. That's how much people have applied for. The shallower line below is how much the legislature's been able to award. To give you an idea of the total demand for this, the programs were established in 2005. And for PBP, we've had applications for over $500 million, that's with the B, 534 million in requests. And we've been able to fund about 115 million, that's with an M. So again, 1 in 5. Turning now to safe routes to school, again, it's eliminating crashes, it's increasing the number of kids walking or biking, which today is under 12% of all trips to school. If we've got all of the children within a mile of the school, that would be 26% of trips to school. If you were alive in 1969, 50% of kids walked or biked to school. So there's some room for growth if we can overcome the challenges and barriers. These grants, these awards have to be within 2 miles of a school, measured as a child would travel. So it's road distance, not as the crow flies. And again, highly competitive. The applications since the beginning of the program have been nearly $500 million with a B, 499.4 million. And we've been able to award about 135 million. So you can see this cumulative demand. Want to let you know about some planning we're now embarking on for updating the process around applying for it. And I have several slides, and I'm not going to touch on all of them because I understand that you'll be getting a PDF of the slides, but the next one gives you a sense of where we need to go. The legislature directed us to report to them on recommended changes to our processes, both for applying and for selecting awardees. So we increase utilization by a greater diversity of jurisdictions. And remember how competitive it already is, and that's with the jurisdictions that keep coming back successfully. We're supposed to get more jurisdictions applying and succeeding. I think the numbers for cities alone, there's about 85 cities that have applied. There's over 280 cities in the state. So there will be challenges. As we develop this recommended set of changes, we're going to keep the HEAL Act in mind so that we plan forward for those requirements that we'll be complying with as an agency. So we'll be figuring out what this all looks like. So stay tuned, report will come out December 1st. The next slide is just additional context on the HEAL Act, but what I want to get to is the one about where we are now and where we will be going, our prior criteria, the ones we have today. We did an analysis of this year's applications, and less than 40% of the safe routes focused in those kind of equity emphasis areas, overburdened communities, ones feeling the harms of the past. We awarded over half of safe routes funds to those places. In the Ped Bike program, 12% were in those places. We awarded almost 40% to those areas. So consider that as you go forward, your trail projects that score high on safety and high on equity will be the ones that have the greatest chance of success. And that last slide is just contact information, and I'll drop some links into the chat. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Barb. And I see your links are in the chat to the Active Transportation Plan and the Rails to Trail Conservancy Federal Policy Platform. Okay, we'll move next to Marguerite's presentation.
Thank you very much. This looks like it's the second part of my presentation, and so I'm just going to start right here. I am Marguerite Austin. I work for a small state agency. It's Washington State's Recreation and Conservation Office. A big part of what we do at our agency is we provide grants for both federal funds and state funds for all types of trail development. A big focus of those trails is what comes out of our planning process. We are responsible for developing the state comprehensive outdoor recreation plan, as well as the state's trails plan, its non-highway and off-road vehicle activities plan, and other plans that help to guide our system of cross-state trails. Next. There are 5 programs that we currently administer that have a direct and a specific tie-in to our trail-related projects. The first is the Aquatic Lands Enhancement Account. It provides funding to acquire, restore, improve aquatic lands, and provide educational information for individuals about those aquatic resources. This is a program that people don't often think about as part of our trail portfolio, but this is the one that supports mostly our water trail system. So just a quick reminder to folks, you'll notice each slide will give you
Sorry, Marguerite, I'm sorry to interrupt. It looks like we've lost your audio.
audio issue.
There you
And
go.
just let me know if you can hear me now.
Yes,
Great.
now we can
Thank
hear
you very
you.
much.
Thank you.
And we can just move on to our next slide. The Land and Water Conservation Fund happens to be a federal grant program that we help to administer. This program in particular is one that provides grants from the beginning of our organization until now. And those grants range from $25,000 to $500,000. We get 10 to 12 million each biennium. The grants are offered on a biennial basis, and they are used for all sorts of outdoor recreational trails, both in the urban environment as well as in some of the backcountry areas. Next, the Non-Highway and Off-Road Vehicle Activities Program is an extremely popular program for us. This one happens to be the one that focuses on the backcountry trail systems. And when we talk about our backcountry trail systems, we're talking about trails for off-road vehicle riding. This is both motorized, non-motorized, our equestrian trail systems. This program provides grants not just for acquisition of trail rights of way or trail corridors, but also for development, for maintenance and operation activities, as well as for education and enforcement. And we expect about 11 million each biennium for this program. Next up is the Recreational Trails Program. And Kevin mentioned that program and spoke about we get about 3.6 million each biennium. This program really focuses on the backcountry trail systems and its amenities. Our agency has elected to place the focus for this particular program on providing grants to help maintain trails, so the log out and brush out. This is one of our few programs where federal agencies actually are eligible applicants, as well as those of you who represent cities, counties, nonprofit trail-related organizations. This is a very popular program for that. Our grant applications for both NOVA and Recreational Trails Program is in the fall, and our next application deadline is November 1st of 22. The last program that I want to mention is the Washington Wildlife and Recreation Program. And I think Christine will share a lot more about this program, but what I do want to say about it is it has 5 categories in the outdoor recreation account, and all 5 categories support development of trails or acquisition of trails in some form or another. It ranges from state lands development, where state agencies are building trail systems, to state parks, who works on our cross-state trail system, as well as the trails that we talk about for just our typical urban trails as well. A very popular program, highly competitive, as you've heard, and this is also one of our key trails programs too. Next slide just shares some basic data about getting in touch with us. To contact us, we have a team of 10 outdoor grants managers who work across the state to help applicants as they provide for and develop. We just encourage you to contact us. A lot of great information on our website, and we are happy to answer any of your questions about the types of grants that we have to offer and our timeline for getting those done, and to help you to kind of develop your project so it's most competitive. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marguerite. I know people are going to have a lot of questions, but we have one more presentation for you in the state section, and we'll turn it over to Christine to get us up to speed on the Washington Wildlife and Recreation Program. Over to you, Christine.
Thanks so much, Monica, and I will be as rapid as I can through all of this. And thanks to Marguerite and Barb for giving us a great thing to build upon. I am the executive director at the Washington Wildlife and Recreation Coalition. We are an independent nonprofit that does advocacy for outdoor recreation and conservation around the state. We know that buying land and building parks and trails is really expensive, as most of you can attest. So we believe reliable public funding is absolutely critical to making these happen. And that's why my predecessors at the coalition lobbied the legislature to create a source of funding for outdoor recreation and conservation projects way back in 1989 and 1990. They very modestly named that grant program after themselves, the Washington Wildlife and Recreation Program. If I could go back in time and tell them the confusion this would create between the WWRC and the WWRP, I would. But instead, we just have to live with it. So next slide. This grant program helps local governments, nonprofits, and state agencies buy and develop land for outdoor recreation and conservation all across the state. It's a nationally recognized program for its fair and scientifically sound process to funding. And it's a competitive grant program managed very professionally and efficiently by the RCO. And I don't just say that because Marguerite's on the call, but she and her team of grant managers really are amazing. So while they manage all the ins and outs of the program, from applications to the disbursement of money and follow-up visits, the coalition gets to do some of the more fun work. Next slide. We do community engagement, raising awareness, facilitating connections among communities so that they're aware of the opportunities and able to present the most compelling grants possible. We also do advocacy efforts for the program. RCO, as a state agency and as state employees, are legally unable to lobby the legislature for robust funding, as it should be. But the coalition takes on this effort along with our help of partners around the state, including folks like all of you. Next slide. Since the creation of the program, our joint efforts have led to over $1.8 billion in funding being leveraged for over 1,600 projects around the state. So this is a huge impact. And as you'll see on the next slide, and as Marguerite mentioned, there are many different categories, everything from critical habitat to farmland, water access, and of course, trails, as we're all here to talk about. Next slide. I am going to focus on the trails category here, but as Marguerite mentioned, there are many other categories that support trails development too. WWRP is one of, if not the biggest funder for trails in our state, and there is no grant limit. So you can look big, but we do encourage phasing as well where it's relevant. Total funding for grants totally depends upon how much the legislature allocates, similar to what Barb was talking about earlier. And that's where the WWRC and our partners come in. For an example, last year we secured a record matching $100 million for the full WWRP, which resulted in $9.5 million for trails. Next slide. So who is eligible? As you saw on Marguerite's slide earlier, it's city and county governments, federally recognized tribes, state land management agencies, and special purpose districts like ports and such. On the next slide, some important things for you to know. There, like I mentioned earlier, there is no grant maximum, but phasing is encouraged where appropriate. There is generally a 50% match requirement for projects to make sure that there's local investment as well as the state, although this is reduced for in-need communities, and volunteer labor and in-kind gifts can be counted towards that match as well. Funds can be used to develop, acquire, or renovate existing facilities, and they're intended for pedestrian, equestrian, bicycle, and cross-country skiing. Next slide. These trails must be non-motorized, and they must be separated from the roadway by space and or physical barriers. So things like sidewalks and road shoulders aren't eligible, but the trails can be natural or hard surface, and supportive trail infrastructure like trailheads, parking, picnic areas, and restrooms are also eligible. Next slide. For a group like this, I want to emphasize the importance of partnerships. All projects in WWRP are encouraged to show community engagement and have and support in order to have competitive applications. But some of the most successful trails projects in recent years have included in-depth partnerships between nonprofits, user groups, and agencies. A really great example of this is the Palouse to Cascades Trail, which I know many of you are familiar with, spanning the entire state. But some of the more regional ones include Berry County Rail Trail, the Olympic Discovery Trail, and right here in our area, the Foothills Rails to Trails. So next slide. And this one's some of the more wonky details, as with the next slide, I believe, but since you're getting a PDF, I won't go through all of these. Just know that beyond these details, I really encourage you to contact Marguerite and her team for more support. They're the true in-depth experts. And in addition to what Marguerite shared, I have some more contact information at the end of my presentation. So next slide, we'll share the timeline. In brief, it's important to note that applications will be submitted next spring between February and March, and then RCO goes to all the work of processing the application, ensuring everything was submitted properly and all the technical aspects are properly addressed. And then there's a presentation to the review panel. That panel is a group of volunteer experts who evaluate the project against the grant criteria and give it a score based on how well the grant application meets each of those criteria. Applicants are then placed on a ranked list within its category. So it's important to note here that applications are kept within the category. So trails applications aren't competing with local parks or habitat projects. The legislature has set a fairly wonky allocation formula that determines how funding is divided among those categories. So once they allocate the full funding for the program, and again, this is done during odd year budget legislative cycles. So we just got funding this year, and the next one will be allocated in 2023. The money is allocated out to the different categories and then just flows down the list, with the best projects being funded first, and then the money continuing to flow down the list, similar to what Barb was talking about earlier. Next slide. That's the area where the work of the coalition really comes in. We work hard every year to ensure that robust support is provided from the legislature. We are adamantly bipartisan, working to build support from legislators on both sides of the aisle and from all corners of the state, because the program really does serve the whole state. The more funding that's available for the program, the more we all benefit. So we definitely need all of your help on this as well. During budget years, we obviously do a lot of work in Olympia, including sign-on campaigns, grassroots engagement, and even a legislative day that has become virtual in this virtual world. We also do work year in and year out, getting legislators out to projects so that they can see the impact of those projects directly on the ground. So if any of you have received WWRP funding in the past and want to get your legislators out to your project and want some help with that, just get in touch and I'd be delighted to work with you. I also encourage all of you to sign up for our newsletter so you can stay updated and get engaged on these efforts. And I included a bit.ly link there, and I'll drop it in the chat in a little bit too. So next slide, I just included a few resources for all of you. And with these bit.ly links, a reminder that capitalization is important. Just know that RCO has a lot of very helpful materials on their website. And additionally, one off chance benefit of COVID is that the last grant cycle, the presentations had to go virtual, meaning that you can now watch the previous grant applications and get a better idea of how those presentations go. Finally, the coalition may be able to connect you to some pro bono support, especially for underserved communities. So if you need some help and think you might qualify for that, just let us get in touch with me and I'd be happy to chat more about that with you. And I included as well a link there about the match reduction. So finally, just a link to some contact information for me. as well as the RCO grant managers here in the greater Puget Sound area. These are all folks that work as part of Marguerite's team. They all focus on different areas. So they are really great professionals and do great work. So I encourage you to use them as resources as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Christine. Lots of great information. And now we'll open it up to your questions. So please at this time, take a moment to type your question into the chat, or you can again use the raise hand icon. And here is a question from Fred Wirt. I think this will probably be for either Marguerite or Christine. Is there a plan to place a limit on the WWRP Trails program such that more applicants can be successful?
So Christine, I guess I can answer that. Hi, Fred. It's good to hear from you. Last year, we took a proposal to the Recreation and Conservation Funding Board to consider whether or not they wanted to place limits on the amount of funding that folks are requesting. And the board elected at that time to not move forward with a request for limits. It seems like many applicants kind of limit things within themselves. So they did hear a proposal to consider that, but they have not made a decision to put limits on that program at this time.
Next question from Larry. The state budget included funding for equity-oriented capital grant programs. Will nonprofits be able to apply per the Outdoor Recreation Equity Program proposal RCO had requested of the governor and legislature? When will RCO release the rules for this program?
That is a great question. That's another program. It was another assignment that came to the Recreation and Conservation Office. We have a team that's currently working to develop the program guidelines for it. Our recreation study is underway. The equity study is underway, and we hope to have some preliminary results available to the public by early January. In terms of the grants for planning, we are working on a timeline. Initially, it was hoped that we would be able to get something up and running in November, December, but alas, just with all the other workload, it may not be till the first of the year when we actually start to, offer those grants. So stay tuned. We will be making sure. And if you have not signed up, I encourage you to go to our website at www.rco.wa.gov, and you can sign up for our mailing list, and you can specifically say you're interested in recreation equity grants, and then we'll make sure that as information becomes available for that program, we'll make sure to share that with you.
And I'm just going to pop in here. I see Larry also asked which legislators do we have to thank for that. And I just wanted the coalition and our partners did a lot of advocacy work on this year, and wanted to thank Representative Theringer, especially for partnering to get that all to happen. So I do encourage you all to thank him for that as well.
Great, thank you. Unfortunately, we have to wrap up this section on state funding. I know folks probably have lots more questions, but again, you can email those to claire@leaflinetrails.org, and we'll make sure you get the answers, and you'll also be getting a PDF of all of the slides, which has more information. So with that, we will move on to our next topic, on local funding. And as we know, local funding can be as diverse as the many number of communities and agencies we have in our 4-county Puget Sound region. And the speakers we have today just bring so much passion and strategic thinking when it comes to funding for trails. Mayor Pat Johnson of Buckley has served her community as an elected official for over 30 years as mayor and on the city council. She's also active as a volunteer, serving on the boards of the Foothills Rails to Trails Coalition and the Tacoma Pierce County Public Health Board. She's an avid hiker and logs between 800 and 1,000 miles per year. Tracy Stanton is the executive director of the Emerald Alliance, which seeks collaboration across sectors to protect our vital resource lands and open space. Tracy has over 20 years of experience in environmental policy and conservation finance. And Tom Tigan is Snohomish County's Director of Conservation and Natural Resources. Tom's 37-year career has focused on parks, recreation, and economic development, as well as empowering communities. So welcome to Mayor Pat, Tracy, and Tom. And Mayor Pat, I'll turn it over to you to kick us off.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Marcia. The Foothills Trail actually started in Buckley in the mid-'80s. After the city was awarded the railroad right-of-way that actually came over Snoqualmie Pass and with a destination of Tacoma. But in a court case, we were able to get all the railroad property that was within our city limits. And it's a stretch about 1.5 miles long. Back then, the town doctor, Doc Tate, wanted to see the rail corridor turned into a linear park to be used by walkers, bikers, and horses to have a safe corridor to use without competition with the highway traffic. Doc Tate joined forces with Pierce County Parks and backcountry horsemen and community members around Pierce County to sell the idea of a connected trail system. And that's how the Rails to Trails Coalition was formed. Today, the Foothills Trail in Buckley is the new Main Street. And along the trail, we have our log show grounds, our cemetery, our armory, Wally's Drive-In, a museum, the Buckley Hall, library, post office, youth center, skate park, and where we also hold concerts in the park in the summertime. The trail is our largest park. It's our most heavily used park, and it's the cheapest park that we have to maintain. But trails are not cheap, even when you're given the land. And so where is all the money hiding? And we've seen a lot here so far on the federal and state level, but even the counties have money for parks and are willing to work with different coalitions and groups and cities to help accomplish that. There's a lot of grants out there, and you just have to know where they are and to find them. Don't be afraid to ask for donations. Many nonprofits have grants for improving healthy living. And there are several foundations out there also now. And don't be afraid to advertise that you need money for grant matches or for whatever, for designing, to ask people for money. One of the things, it turned out, it started out as a joke and people are still taking it seriously. Our cemetery runs through, the trail runs right by our cemetery. And one time at a meeting, I jokingly said that we were going to be selling lots that were trail side along, so you could be buried on the trail, by the trail, and you'd have a mountain view. And people took that seriously, and that was about 5 or 6 years ago. And occasionally we still get a call wanting to know if those lots are available. Someday they will be, but not for a few more years. You know, you can also, to get amenities, memorial amenities along the trail are helpful to provide benches, water fountains, you know, whatever is needed, and signage and minor repair work. So, you know, it's just that you can't leave any rock unturned. But learn to lobby. That is probably the most important thing that we can do, is to know how to lobby, when to lobby, and who to lobby. Know your county and state and federal elected officials. know how to get a hold of them. Even our federal elected officials have local offices staffed by very competent employees. And I almost have all of my county and state reps. I have their private cell phone numbers. And I promise them I won't call them unless I really need something. And so when I do need something, they call. And my county rep, he knows that if my garage door is open when he goes by my house, that I'm home and he can stop in and chat, and he does. He trains for triathlon, so he's riding his bike through Buckley. But it is really important to get to know the staff because they are the keepers of the schedule. And if you're constantly calling and with nothing very substantial, they're not going to pay attention to you. So, like I say, be nice, be thankful, and be very respectful of the staff. Be concise in your meetings. A lot of times your meeting is going to be with staff, and 15 minutes is considered a long meeting. And when you testify before the legislators at a committee, don't be surprised if 3 minutes is all you get. I've been to some where 1.5 minutes, and you're talking a mile a minute and trying to get the most important things across. But be concise and be on time, don't be late. And also learn who else, either on your county commissioners or the state legislature, who else are friends of the trail, and keep them posted on what you're doing and what you're trying to accomplish. And that doesn't take a lot of time either, but just make sure that they're up to speed on what you're doing. But learning to lobby was one of the most important things I learned as a mayor and as a council member. You have to be able to sell your project and be thorough on the information that is on the grant application. Be able to back up the information if asked, and make sure all cost items are correct. Make sure your project fits the scope of the grant that the grant is looking for. You're wasting your time and the grantor's time if you are not. Few grants will cover the full cost of the project. Make sure you can cover cost overruns or required matching funding. And that's very important because you don't want to get 3/4 of the way through your project and find out that, wait a minute, we've gone over budget. We can't afford this. We can't complete it. Because the next time you ask for money through a granting agency, there's a good chance you won't get it. If you're using volunteers, always keep track of their time because that time has value to it. And I can't remember what the current volunteer time, what value they put on it, but sometimes it's as much as $15 an hour, and that can be used towards your match in some cases. But find out if you can use volunteer time also. And when giving presentations, always take an elected official with you. And I know that sounds kind of funny or snobbish or whatever, but the staff generally prepares the presentations, but it's the elected that sells it. The staff is being paid to be there. The elected generally is not. And that helps a lot, especially when you can answer the questions about, where's the money coming from? How are you putting it together? But it's always important to have at least one elected official with you. Every time that I have been on a presentation team, we've gotten the grant, and I've been the only elected official there. So that pretty much wraps up, how a small town goes by about getting funding for the trails and for amenities along the way. But like I say, the trail in Buckley is the new Main Street, and you can go from one end to the other if you're stopping at the post office, or, you know, you've got kids at the skate park or the youth center, or you want to pop into the museum and see what else they've got, there's indoor and outdoor exhibits. So I'll answer any questions.
Thank you, Mayor Pat. We're actually going to take questions at the end of the presentation, so hold that thought. And we'll go ahead and we'll move to Tracy Stanton's presentation on regional open space funding. Tracy, take it away.
Great. Thanks so much, Monica. Yeah, let's hold it on that slide for a second. So the Emerald Alliance focuses on promoting the values and benefits that flow from our natural systems. We also are working to catalyze greater collaboration across the work of conservation organizations. That includes governments and nonprofits and foundations. And we're also leading with a lens of focused on equity in conservation investments. So the role that the Emerald Alliance on this panel today, my part is to focus on putting the funding in the context of overall funding for conservation, but specifically to share some analysis of a funding, some results of a funding analysis that I worked on in collaboration with ESA and Associates focused on our regional conservation plan here in Central Puget Sound. But before I go to the data, this slide really captures the essence of the vision of the Emerald Alliance, which is a interconnected regional system of our landscapes and all of the many things that we, the people, do and how we interact with those landscapes. So that's sort of overarching how we view the role of our natural systems and our natural infrastructure. So next slide, please. So this work that, and the funding analysis really builds off of the work of Puget Sound Regional Council and their creation of an open space plan back in 2018. And what they did in the context of this plan was to articulate a system of a network of connected landscapes that are represented by different land use types: forests, farms, aquatic systems, and trails is a component of our connected open space system across Puget Sound. The other component of what PSRC did in this plan was to articulate of that connected network across the 4 central Puget Sound counties, what's protected already. We all know the incredible growth projections for Central Puget Sound, and that puts our open space and our landscapes at risk for conversion. So we wanted to get a sense of what's already protected within this network, and leading to then the next slide, please, what's not protected. And this is an expression of the conservation needs that are part of that plan across 4 central Puget Sound counties and these 8 watersheds and these open space types, and regional trails factor squarely into this conservation plan and the conservation needs. Next slide, please. So this funding analysis is really built around lands not in long-term protection. And if we're focused on how do we then focus on protecting those lands, we wanted to start with, well, how are we already doing it? What's the current sort of configuration of social capital? What's the organizational structure? And what's the funding analysis look like for protecting open space and land conservation at a regional scale? Next slide, please. So there's a very big workbook that has a lot of raw data in it. And so this is an attempt to pull that out to share some of the highlights with you, starting with just some of that social capital. Who's doing this work on a regional scale? And some of it we've already heard a lot about today from our state partners and local partners and federal partners, funding the work of not just trails, but open space acquisition in general. And this funding analysis really does focus on the acquisition and easement work. So convening organizations, they may not have a funding role, but they tend to work at the local level to coordinate actions, collectively seeking to fund projects and advocating for policy. This is not an exhaustive list by any stretch, but what you can start to see here are where convening is happening. There's quite a bit around farmland as shown in this particular chart. And we also know that from some of the other data and in other parts of the spreadsheet that it differs geographically. So it's not as robust in some counties as you see in other counties. Next slide, please. So organizations with a specific funding role. And so when we say funding, these are groups that play a role in prioritizing and ranking projects for state and federal funding, as we heard from both Marguerite and Christine. And also potentially even selecting projects to get prioritized in program funding, such as from floodplains by design. And again, the key takeaway from this is just looking at the groups that are working on aquatic systems and natural lands. Many fewer working on working forests, farmland, and regional trails. And where it starts to get messy is salmon recovery is represented here. And so there are a lot of places where land conservation is an outcome of the work of groups focused on salmon recovery, even though that's not necessarily the focus. Next slide, please. So state funding. We heard a lot about this already, and so I won't take a lot of time here, but it's just an interesting way that in the analysis that we did, wanting to see who's guiding funding and how is that funding hitting the ground in the protection of what aspect of open space and natural systems. And trails, as we have already heard, is reasonably well represented. None of this is to suggest that there's adequate funding for any of the needs. The needs are much greater than the funding that we have, but we wanted to just, again, see how this funding is hitting the ground and through which entities. It's also important to note that it does not represent the financing mechanism side of funding. So for example, funding from the Clean Water Revolving Loan Fund, which can be used for acquisition, it's not available. It's not represented here. So county funding, we just heard a bit about this from Mayor Pat. There's a fair amount of meat and potatoes here for open space and land conservation, and also for trails. And what's interesting to see here again is we have dollars in terms of the robustness of funding from about 2019 to 2021 on an order of magnitude, again, in this really messy spreadsheet. But this just helps see where on the county scale, what we take away from this is use of tools such as conservation futures and our parks levies and fees from utilities and surface water management, and how those dollars are working to protect the landscapes across the counties. And we'll go to the next slide. So the general takeaway, the kind of big takeaway from this funding analysis is we recognize and we see that there's quite a bit of funding going for aquatic system and natural lands. And of course, that's largely driven by our listed salmon species and the whole infrastructure that's set up for salmon recovery. And groups are really working on the protection, or the funding is actually being worked on across cross purposes, and I mean that in a good way. So for example, farm fish flood, there's a lot of collaboration happening to look at multiple benefits that come from the investment in one big project. And it does attend to farm fish and flood, among many others, potentially in one particular project. It also, the analysis showed us where we are not necessarily funding as well, and where we could be focusing on tapping in resources from opportunities from the Land and Water Conservation Fund and other funds coming down the pike. So with that, I'll turn it back to Monica. I'm happy to put in the links to the regional open space plan. And if anyone's interested in seeing the really gnarly spreadsheet, I'm happy to walk you through that. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tracy. Just in the interest of time, because we're starting to run a little bit behind schedule, so I'll ask Tom to jump in and maybe abbreviate his remarks a little bit, because we have one more speaker. Sarah Gutchow from PSRC will be joining us to talk about the federal funding. So Tom, take it away.
All right, Tom Tigan with Snohomish County Department of Conservation and Natural Resources. The fact is, trails are economic development tools. They are economic drivers. Actually, parks, recreation, tourism, all those elements, they are economic drivers in our region. Just in Snohomish County alone, outdoor recreation is $2 billion industry annually. And then when you add in agriculture and other pieces to that, it's significant. So I really hope you all can learn how to work with both the for-profit community as well as nonprofit. And apologize, just right now, our puppy needs to go out. Unbelievable. So, so what I'd like to do first is give you my phone number, because this is kind of an individualized approach. You actually need to know and collect data for your location, whether that's a small town or the city of Seattle or a regional approach. You need to be able to collect data and disseminate data and use it accordingly when you're approaching for-profit partners in particular. So, getting close to the door. Sorry, I thought we'd be done by now, so it's been interesting. In any case, my phone number is 425, my cell, 425-754-9158. I really want to make sure I understand that cultivating relationships with for-profit partners, government doing that it's an important tool in the tool belt. We don't typically do it very well. We tend to be a little less than communicative with the business community. And so that's something that would have to shift. I can give you some strategies and thought process on that. The other thing is having actual data. I don't know what everybody's approach is, but like in Snohomish County, we actually create geofences around a lot of our major assets, our trail systems, our river systems, individual park sites. That collects data on anybody with a cell phone coming into the site. It doesn't give me any personal data. This isn't an invasion of privacy, but having tools in our tool belt that shows the number of people that visit, where they typically come from, how often they're visiting, how often they're on our river systems, our trails, at our major assets, the Evergreen State Fairgrounds and others like that, or the airport, Payne Field. So using data, being willing to approach corporate partners and understand what they value and why it's important to their employees, more important to their bottom line. Clearly, we know that trails, there are many, many, many great brew pubs and restaurants and ice cream shops and things that are located along regional trails or in or out of parks. We know that enterprise and parks can work. Certainly, I was with King County, we introduced, concerts at Marymore, and we're about Cirque du Soleil to Marymore Park and several other initiatives. The same thing here in Snohomish County. We've engaged with the business community and corporate community, and corporate partners can invest. Certainly, just recently, King County made some great announcements that a number of folks have been working on, tied to investments by REI, investments by Amazon, investments by all forms of companies and trail systems. So it's not simple, and it's probably less comfortable for many of us in Parks and Recreation or natural resources, but working with for-profit communities really can create an opportunity to put some of our projects over the finish line. And I think it's about cultivating relationships, and whether that's with your local Economic Development Commission or with broader EDAs, whether or not it's with the chambers or chamber members. I do agree with the mayor who previously said, yes, bring elected officials along. It's great to tie all the connectivity between what government does and what private business does and what our residents and visitors and citizens want to see and have as far as amenities, particularly with trails. So if you have a downtown association, if you have Rotaries and Kiwanis and all those groups, they all play a role in creating kind of a connective environment for co-investment by the private sector. And again, it's not something that many of us as professionals have spent a lot of time on, but I have a background in economic development as well as being a parks director and now a conservation natural resource director. So you've got my phone number. I'm trying to bring us back on track really quickly. I didn't do a PowerPoint because you know what, when you're later in the slides, typically it's going to be bunched, right, Monica? So be more than willing to talk to anybody if they have questions about stuff and give you some of the tools that we're using and maybe help co-develop some there.
Great. Thank you so much, Tom. And thank you for being aware of our time constraints here. I want to make sure that we have time for folks to ask some questions. And we do have one in the chat, and I encourage folks to go ahead. We'll have maybe just a minute or so for questions. Tom, there was a question for Tom. Do you purchase that data from self-service providers, or do you have a partnership that allows you to access that data at no to low cost?
Yeah, it's very low cost. We actually put together a program through our tourism portfolio, and that's resided in parks for the last several years. We're moving it back to EcoDevo this next year in 22. But yeah, we did. And then that allowed a bunch of our city partners to also buy in at a very low rate. So we did the significant investment of about $50K to begin with. But yes, it's better to typically work through vendors. And I can connect you up on some of those dots too, if you want to connect offline.
Great. Any other questions for our local presenters, for Mayor Pat, for Tracy, or Tom? Here's one. How impactful has the geocaching data insights been to developing and maintaining trails? That's a question for Tom.
Yeah, that's the geocaching is so geocaching as a sport or as a you know a use, right? A use out in the parks that has been good. I know that certain areas it's been a little harder to decipher, but in general terms, anytime we can actually get better data, and like for example, right now we have you know an Amazon fulfillment center coming into Arlington. We have other ancillary businesses that pop up around that. What's the connectivity of the regional trails? How many people are they bringing in? How are they getting there? You know, how great is it to walk 20 minutes a day to lower our healthcare costs? How do you connect all these different little indiscriminate dots and create a plan for saying, hey, you know what, a co-investment of $500,000, $2 million would be great to connect you to all these other amenities, both businesses as well as you know, recreational trails and transportation. So kind of the sky's the limit, but it's very customized. So again, I would be glad to talk with any of you. That's why I did the cell phone.
Thank you, Tom. I think with that, I know there's more questions, but we'll take those offline and get responses back to folks. Again, thank you so much to Mayor Pat, Tracy, Tom for participating today. We're going to go to our final section, come back actually to our beginning on federal funding, and Sarah Gutchow, Senior Transportation Planner with the Puget Sound Regional Council, is here to give us a few more specifics on some of the federal programs that Kevin touched on at the beginning of our session today. A key role of the PSRC is to help communities secure federal funding for transportation, including funding for regional trails. And Sarah's primarily responsible for leading the agency's bicycle and pedestrian work planning program and managing the Federal Transit Administration funding. Sarah, thanks for joining us today. Glad you could be here. We'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Monica. And just to give a little bit of background for anyone not familiar with the Puget Sound Regional Council, we are the metropolitan planning organization for the four-county region of King, Snohomish, Kitsap, and Pierce. And as Monica mentioned, we are responsible for project selection processes for multiple federal transportation funding sources that are eligible for trails projects. And we do distribute federal funds, but all of our project selection processes distribute the federal funding using the eligibility requirements of those federal sources, but also using our own regionally adopted criteria. So I'll focus here today on the federal highway funding programs, as they're the ones most eligible for trail projects. So we have the Surface Transportation Block Grant Program, formerly known as the Surface Transportation Program, or STP, which you may have heard of under that name, and the CMAQ, the Congestion Mitigation and Air Quality Improvement Program. And then we also distribute our Federal Transit Administration funding, which technically can be used for trail projects near transit stations, but with some restrictions. but primarily through the FHWA programs, including 2 standalone competitions for the Rural Town Centers and Corridors program, which can be used for trail funding, and then the Transportation Alternatives program, which is very focused on bicycle and pedestrian projects. So I'll be providing more information on those. For our regular project selection process, that's every 2 years, sometimes 3 years, where we program FHWA and FTA funds into the future. So the next process will be for programming 2025 and 2026 funding. The previous years have already been programmed into our state transportation improvement program. For each year, we have about $260 million to distribute. So that's about 180 on the FTA side, but then 80 million on the federal highway side. We have very specific defined project evaluation criteria that are based on Vision 2050, which is the regional long range plan, and then the regional transportation plan and the regional outcomes within there. So the focus there is on supporting local centers and regional centers, mobility and accessibility, safety, equity, and climate and air quality. Next slide. So to give a little more information about these different funding sources, and hopefully this is not too repetitive of what the previous presentation on federal funding, as I know I missed that one. So we have for the Surface Transportation Block Grant Program, it's the most flexible of any of the FAST Act programs, and it can be used for a wide range of programs, including bicycle and pedestrian funding. For CMAQ, it's a bit more restrictive as projects need to demonstrate an air quality benefit. So some general purpose projects are not eligible. We also, for our particular project selection process, have a set aside that is only for bicycle and pedestrian projects, which is distributed through our countywide groups. And we are still setting the policies for the 2022 process. But if you've been following along, you might know that this was 10% in 2020, and there is some discussion on raising this percentage for the next process. So both of these sources are eligible for trail projects, but there are more restrictions for CMAQ funds. So to be successful for CMAQ funding, the project should be more transportation focused and not recreational focused, and also demonstrate that they can reduce vehicle miles traveled, for example, by providing an alternative commute. So I think we're, okay, and so next slide. So as I mentioned, all these projects can be used, all these funding sources can be used for bicycle pedestrian projects. And then we also have a specific set aside that is only for bicycle and pedestrian projects. But we get this question a lot in terms of how is that used? So even though there were only 26 standalone bicycle and pedestrian projects, so that's trail projects and other types of projects like sidewalk improvements, which was about $28 million. For all of the projects all put together for FHWA, 75% of projects, even if it was a roadway project or a transit project, did have bicycle and pedestrian facilities included. So to give an idea of how this worked for trails in 2020, some prominent examples of different trail projects that were funded were the trail extensions for the Interurban Trail in Fife and Milton. Those were 2 separate projects. And then we also had 2 separate projects for the Tacoma Water Ditch Trail, which you can see on your screen. That's the image on the right of the extension for 3A. Okay, next slide. So as mentioned, we have our Transportation Alternatives Program, which is a program that's a little bit wonky because it's eligible for so many different types of projects. It's for community-based projects that enhance the transportation system. It is a set aside of the STBG program. And we do this competition not on a regular basis, it's more ad hoc. But as luck would have it, we're actually about to kick off our 2021 TAP competition on Friday, this Friday. So there are 3 categories of eligible activities that we group into bicycle and pedestrian, historic resources, and environmental. The large majority of the applications we receive are for the bicycle and pedestrian projects, which includes trails. And then the sponsors that are eligible is expanded to local governments, tribes, transit agencies, and in certain cases, nonprofits. And we have had cases where nonprofits are also eligible to participate if they partner with an eligible agency. So for our last competition was in 2017, so it was a few years ago. We had 17.5 million to recommend, and we were able to use it for 12 projects. So that was 2 trail projects and then one historic resource project, and then the remaining were other types of bicycle and pedestrian projects. So this funding can be used for trails. And then, as I mentioned, we are kicking off the next competition this month, just later this week. So for this, we'll have $13.5 million funding available for the years 2022, 2023, and 2024. There are some limitations. We're limiting it to 2 applications per agency this year, and the project can at most request 2.5 million. And then we have some specific project evaluation criteria that is similar to the regular FHWA process, focused on support for centers. There's also some specific criteria for each category, and the focus for that specific criteria for both the TAP competition as well as the regular FHWA funding is supporting housing and economic development, pointing to specific current or anticipated problems for new projects, and looking at benefits to specified user groups and populations designated in the President's Order for Environmental Justice, looking at long-term improvements for circulation, but also increasing system continuity, depending on the area where the project takes place. And then also benefits for safety and active transportation are another big area there. And then also benefits for reducing emissions generally for climate change and air quality. And then we also talk about project readiness and having a reasonable financial plan. And just to give a little more information there, for all FHWA programs, funding can be used for any phase for PE plus one other phase or only one phase. And then phases must be fully funded and projects must be consistent with local and regional plans. Next slide. So just to reiterate, we have the TAP competition coming up in October, and a little later in October, we'll also be starting our new 2021 Rural Town Centers and Corridors program, which has less funding available, but that funding is eligible for trails. And then starting in most likely January, we'll be kicking off our regular 2022 FHWA project selection process. And there's more information about previous competitions and future competitions if you go to our website at the address on your screen.
Wow, thank you so much, Sarah. That was so much to get through in a short amount of time, but valuable information and a great timing because it looks like there's some funding opportunities that are coming up here shortly. And we can encourage folks to get a hold of you or PSRC to get more information on the application process and all the other things that you have to offer. Any questions for Sarah? We have maybe about a minute. No questions? Okay, well, you know how to get a hold of Sarah if something comes up after our session ends today. And thank you again, Sarah. Oh, it looks like a question just popped into the chat. When's the regional bike network map coming back on the PSRC site?
So I think, that's referring to our regular regional transportation plan, which we are also updating for 2022 at the moment. So we do already have our updated bicycle and pedestrian and shared use path map that is available. If you go to our website under our the visual existing conditions tool, so that it's those facilities as well as transit and other types of facilities. So that's already available for existing facilities, and we're happy to send it as a download for anyone interested. We're working on having a download option available for the map as well. In terms of planned facilities, we have, we're going to be we have our regional capacity project list. I don't think we have it on our website quite yet, but we're still pulling that together for the update to the 2022 to 2050 regional transportation plan.
Thank you so much. And again, I know there are probably dozens more questions out there. Please, again, Claire is available to receive those via email. Claire@leaflinetrails.org. So email your questions. We'll make sure we follow up and get those answered. And Claire, at this point, we're at the end, so I'll turn it over to you for some closing comments.
Sounds good. So similar to yesterday's presentation, would love to just close out in the next 60 seconds. Please type in the chat either one thing you learned today or one thing you would like to know more about. It's really helpful to get a sense of what resonated, what was new or exciting to help inform this coalition's next steps. So again, respond in the chat. What did you learn today? Or what would you like to know more about? And as we approach the very close and start to see those responses coming in, I just wanted to flag what's happening next as part of the summit. So tomorrow we'll be having a lunch hour presentation and discussion that will be really interactive and creative, the opportunity to talk about the challenges or successes you're experiencing in your work and to give and get advice from your peers. It'll be very fun, I promise. Lots of discussion. And then Friday and Saturday, we have 2 policy rides, Friday on the Interurban Trail South and Saturday on the Interurban Trail North. And all of that information is available on our blog, sort of the summit landing page. So we'll also have a Kitsap County ride in November. And just want to recognize the funders who've made this work possible for the coalition, as well as our 50+ organizational members. So as we close here, just want to read out a few of the insights folks are taking away from this session today. Lots of funding opportunities, some comments about the new federal grants, excited about trails as economic development tools, and just sort of a general sense of we're learning lots about grant opportunities and general information. So thank you all for being part of this session today. And with that, we will close out today's session. Feel free to reach me at claire@leaflinetrails.org with questions. But as we end, join me in giving a virtual round of applause to our presenters. A lot of expertise on the line today, and appreciate you volunteering your time to educate and inspire this group. So thank you so much. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.